Good day, everyone. Ma'am Rona here. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I will be discussing psychological perspective of the self. These are the subtopics of the lesson for today. What is psychology? Concept of self in psychological perspective. The self and its selves. Conception of self and concept of unified and multiple self. Before I start, I want you to pause for a minute and think about these questions. How do you describe yourself? Do you think a word will suffice to encapsulate who you are as a person? You can write it down in a piece of paper, or you can just pause for a while and reflect. So before anything else, let us define what psychology means. So psychology comes from the ancient Greek roots, psyche, meaning mind, and logos, meaning knowledge or study. So psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. And just to correct some of your misconceptions, taking psychology won't make you read minds nor the future, okay? Concept of self in psychological perspective. Psychology has various ways of understanding a person and the therapist's way of helping people understand themselves. Psychologists today realize that there is no single perspective that can fully explain complex behavior and the self. So they draw insights from a variety of perspectives. The earliest formulation of the self in modern psychology forms the distinction between the self as I, the person knower, and the self as me, the person that is known. The self and its selves. William James is a psychologist and has introduced the principle of psychology, which contain numerous concepts and distinction of self. For James, his main concepts of the self are the me self and the I self. The self and its selves. I self. So the I self is the self-thought or the self-knower. I self is the subjective self that is aware of its own actions. It's describing yourself using your own perspective. An example of a feature of this I self is the sense of being the agent or initiator of behavior. An example of which is choosing your future profession. For the me self, my parents told me to become a doctor. For the I self, I want to become an artist. You make choices for your own life. Parents and other people will not make a choice for you. So you have the responsibility for your own choices. That's I self. For the me self is the phenomenal self, the experienced self or the self as known. It is the self that is an object or the self you can describe. So it is from the perspective of others or the more objective self. According to James, there are 3 subcategories of the self, and these are the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. Material self is constituted by our bodies, clothes, immediate family, and home. We attach ourselves in this dimension deeply, and therefore we become most affected because of the investment we give to these things. Next is the social self. So the social self is based on our interactions with society and the reaction of people towards us. So it is in our social self that we have different versions of ourselves. It varies as to how we present ourselves to a particular social group. Lastly, and the most intimate self, the spiritual self. These are our personality, character, and defining values. Conception of self. So Carl Rogers is an American psychologist. For Rogers, he came up with the conception of self through his ideas in person-centered therapy. So person-centered therapy is a non-directive intervention that believes that all people have the potential to solve their own problems. Rogers believed that people must be fully honest with themselves in order to have personal discovery. So he also believed that the person is an active being who lives in the present. With this, he came up with the perceived self, the real self, and the ideal self. So the perceived self, or self-worth, how the person sees self and others sees them. So it comprises of what we think about ourselves. So Rogers believed feelings of self-worth developed in early childhood. Next, the real self. Self-image, how the person really is. So it is the actual behavior. This affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves in the world. Lastly, the ideal self, how the person would like to be. So this is the person who we would like to be. It consists of our goals and ambitions in life. A person's ideal self may not be consistent with what actually happens in life and experiences of the person. So, a person's ideal self may not coincide with your real self. And this is called incongruence. So there is an inconsistency between who you are and what you want to be. When a person's ideal self and actual experience are consistent or very similar, a state of congruence exists. So a person's ideal self coincides with his or her real self. Concept of unified and multiple self. For Freud, he perceived a person as a unified being, whereas Jurgen proposed the concept of multiple selves. Ced already discussed Freud's concept, but let's review his concept. So for Freud, the mind is divided into three connected but distinct parts. First is the id. So id as the center of primitive animalistic impulses. For example, food, comfort, and sex. Following the pleasure principle. Next, superego. So superego as the center for ethical imperative, the one that reminds the self of what is right and what is wrong, following morality principle. And lastly, ego. So ego as the moderator between these two, id and superego, which was driven by rationality principle. Although Freud has argued that self has multiple parts, he still believed that ultimately we are unified beings. Whereas for Kenneth Jurgen, proponent of postmodern psychology, the individual has many potential selves. He argued that having a flexible sense of self allows for multiple selves. Remember my questions in the first part of my discussion? How do you describe yourself? And do you think a word will suffice to encapsulate who you are as a person? It can be connected to his idea because for him, a word will not suffice to encapsulate who you are as a person. Because for Jurgen, multiple selfhood is part of what it means to be human, and forcing oneself to stick to one self-concept may be unhealthy. Additional knowledge and reference or summary. Again, psychologists today realize that there is no single perspective that can fully explain complex behavior. They draw insights from a variety of perspectives. So insights from one perspective often complement insights from another perspective as we seek to better understand the whole human being. Various schools of thoughts evolved throughout the development of psychology that continue to shape the way psychologists investigate human behavior and personality. For example, some psychologists might attribute a certain behavior to biological factors such as genetics for the behavior. Because psychologists might emphasize various points within psychology in the research and analysis of behavior and personality, there are different viewpoints in psychology. Human personality is so complex that many perspectives have developed on how to best explain it. So, in a gist, we are looking at the personality and behaviors because it is part of who we are. If you're interested to know more about personality, behavior, or psychology as a whole, we are accepting students in psychology department. Nag-recruit pa. So thank you so much for listening to my lecture. I hope you've learned something. So take care always, guys, and God bless.